Taiwan's population is today over 90% Han Chinese, but their arrival to the island comes relatively late in history. I've written a bit about this in a prior article, but Taiwan's Han Chinese first began settling on the island some 400 years ago. Taiwan Island, however, at the time was not unoccupied. Taiwan's early Han Chinese settlers soon found themselves in conflict with Taiwan's aborigines, the island's first inhabitants. This video briefly goes over the history of these unique and special peoples as a whole. I hope in the future to put out more videos focusing on specific tribes so to help tell their own individual story. But, can't get everything at the same time. Let's start with the tribes themselves. The Taiwanese indigenous people fall into two large categorizations. You have the mountains and the plains peoples. The Taiwanese government recognizes 16 mountains peoples. 9 of those have been recognized since the Japanese colonization period. The others received official status after democratization, or in the 2000s. There are a few other ethnic groups and tribes that have yet to receive official government recognition but maintain a distinct ethnic and societal identity. The plains peoples are a bit harder to distinguish due to heavy intermixing with the Han population. Just 2 have received government recognition. The Kavalan of Ilan, they share a name with the whiskey. I actually don't think they make it. And the Sakazaya people of Hualien, though the Sarayas people, their status is impending. The PRC rejects these categorizations and groups all of the Taiwanese aboriginal tribes into one category called Gaoshan. They make up one of the state's 56 recognized ethnicities alongside the Manchu, Zhuang, and others. We don't have much written history of the Taiwan indigenous people before the Dutch arrival in the 17th century. Much of what we know about that time is based on linguistic studies and archaeology. Archaeological studies in Tainan date human habitation to at least 3000 BC, maybe earlier. A sophisticated society occupied Taiwan at the time, with domesticating pigs and dogs, pottery, and even more. It is theorized that they first emerged from the southern Chinese Dayak populations, considered the original inhabitants of southeast China's coast, and today one of its largest populations after the Han peoples themselves. There are 2 very brief testimonials from Han adventurers during the Song and Yuan dynasties in the 11th and 14th centuries, respectively, about quote-unquote island barbarians, which historians generally believe refer to the Taiwanese aborigines. Another more reliable source goes back to 1603, when a Chinese traveler named Chen Di arrived at what is now Anping in Tainan and reported meeting very diverse peoples living in villages. These villagers knew basic agriculture, made alcohol from fermented rice, and hunted deer. They practiced headhunting and did not wear clothes. If you visited Tainan before, you can probably guess why. It's really hot over there. They had established laws and traditions against theft and other deviant behavior, so they weren't exactly country bumpkins. The Dutch would arrive 20 years later to colonize Taiwan, the first in a long line of foreigner intrusions. They established a fort in Anping and founded what is now the city of Tainan. Establishing contacts with the natives for trade, they describe meeting the same tribes Chen saw 20 years earlier. A census taken in 1650 shows some 68,000 people across 315 villages, though to note this census only covers a very small swath of Taiwan. Throughout the 1600s and 1700s, a variety of governments attempted to take over Taiwan, the Dutch, the Spanish, a Ming-era pirate called Koxinga. Little records exist about how the aborigines acted or were administered then. It appears that the prevailing government policy at the time was to stay the hell away. Here comes the Han. I would not say that things were entirely peaceful between the various Taiwanese tribes as it was, but the arrival of the Han settlers in the 17th century definitely did not help things. The huge influx of Han people to Taiwan disrupted populations and tribes across the island. Vicious conflicts pushed tribes from their original locations to new ones, triggering chain effects. Some went into the mountains, others resettled in eastern Taiwan. For example, let us take the Siraya people living in southern Taiwan. At the beginning of our recorded history, this tribe of peoples originally occupied the agriculturally rich south-central flat plains of West Taiwan. This area now spans Jiayi and Tainan and is the single largest plain on the island. But during the Qing dynasty, Han settlers arriving from the Fujian and Guangdong provinces began pushing the Siraya people eastward to the foot of Taiwan's mountains. However, this area was already occupied by the native Taiwan tribes. The fierce Siraya peoples pushed the Taiwan tribes further and further inland to as far as the central mountain range, where they remain there today. None of this went along peacefully. Qing-era documents record administrators' constant attempts to mediate peace between the Han and the aborigines. Such attempts very often failed, resulting in the famous Qing-era saying, "Every 3 years an uprising, every 5 years a rebellion." In 1871, 66 Japanese sailors found themselves shipwrecked on southern Taiwan Island. Warned against traveling deeper inland by the local Chinese, who also robbed them, they nevertheless went westward and met the Taiwan tribespeople. What happened next remains murky, but the result is that 54 of the sailors were slaughtered by the tribe outside a Hakka trading post. This incident turned into an international crisis. The Japanese used it as an excuse to send a ship to Taiwan so to punish the quote-unquote savages, a move universally condemned by the international community as a move against Qing sovereignty. The Japanese did indeed attempt to colonize the island and put settlers there, but the Qing eventually paid them off. The Qing administration at this time did not realize that the Japanese were trying to claim sovereignty over a part of Taiwan Island, but then again, they really did not have much control over the aborigines anyway, nor were they much competent in of themselves. In 1895, the Qing ceded Taiwan Island entirely to the Japanese, and now the Japanese had to take control and put control of this woolly frontier land. Twice in 1907 and 1915, the Han and the Aborigines stopped fighting against each other and united against the intruders. But the Japanese would eventually succeed in a divide and conquer strategy, subduing the Han population and leaving the Aborigines on their own. The Japanese waged a series of vicious campaigns against the Aborigines, seeing them as uncultured savages. Mountain tribes would continue to wage guerrilla warfare for decades, with the Japanese resorting to electric fences and aerial bombardment of certain villages. Japanese allied Aborigines were employed against rival tribes to retaliate against and suppress quote-unquote uncultured peoples, with the reward of getting their land when they were successful. It was hard times for everyone back then. Over time, the Japanese colonial system shifted from hard suppressive tactics towards cultivating a feeling of togetherness as Japanese subjects of the emperor. Taiwanese people, Han and Aborigines alike, would be recruited to fight alongside other Japanese during their wars of conquest in World War II. But then the Japanese lost World War II and were forced to cede Taiwan to the Republic of China. The Kuomintang takeover resulted in a new policy of inculcating a feeling of Chinese nationalism into the Taiwanese people. This would in turn change as Taiwan moved from feelings of Chinese nationalism to Taiwanese nationalism, encouraged by the DPP. Regardless, being separated from and largely ignored by the majority of Taiwanese society has cost the Aborigines in their economic development at the very least. Many live in areas far away from Taiwan's economic centers, cities or villages on the east coast like Hualien or Taitung, or up in the mountains like Nantou. Studies have found that up to 50% of Aborigines work in blue-collar, semi-skilled and unskilled jobs, though I'll always say that fishing and farming requires more skill than soft-bellied office workers like me. This has become more of an acute issue as Taiwan's economy moves away from heavy industry and construction towards advanced technology. And then in the 1980s, large numbers of illegal foreign labor from Southeast Asia began affecting the blue-collar market. The amount of days urban Aborigines have been able to work were cut by more than half as they found themselves unable to compete with illegals working at 2/3 of the normal salary. One also should mention allegations of prejudice and discrimination. Many local employers are Han, a different race, and interviews with those Han have found them holding stereotypes of Aborigines being lazy, ungrateful, and prone to drinking. The Aborigines, on their part, would prefer not to be overworked with unending amounts of overtime for pay so little such to be at the point of slavery, which is basically how the illegal foreigners are treated. And unlike the illegal foreigners, they can always go back and start and till their land. You can see how bad things can happen from this. Add to this intergenerational wealth issues where poverty being so hard to escape from and getting transmitted from one generation to the next, as in addition to the racial resentments on both sides, it causes a lot of problems, basically. These are all ongoing social issues, and I feel many Americans watching this can sympathize. So to conclude, despite only being 1 or so percent of Taiwan's population, it might be easy to forget them. But the aborigines are a fascinating part of Taiwanese history and a proud peoples with great pasts. They are also plagued with social ills that continue to hurt them in comparison with the Han majority. Taiwan, like the mainland country, sees itself as a democratic nation spanning very many different races. Its government needs to live up to those ideals, and there is still a lot to do when it comes to the Taiwanese Aboriginals. All right, have a good one, everyone. Good night.